Chapter 27. Tayo's biography of Lord Lugard was greeted with critical acclaim. The New York Times named it Biography of the Year, while The Observer described it as the most significant historical text to hail from Africa in recent times. Vanessa knew that Tayo would be touring England to promote the book, but it still came as a surprise when her editor sent her his tour dates and she realized that she would be seeing him. She'd considered contacting him before the event, but decided against it. Better just to appear and not make a fuss. And now, here she was, minutes after he'd seen her, with trembling hands and almost afraid to stay in the room where he was speaking. In the early years, she'd dreamt constantly about this first re-encounter, that they would gaze at each other and everything and everyone around them would just disappear. Of course, she hadn't expected any of that today, not after all these years, but she'd imagined that their meeting would at least be nostalgic. Two old friends, lovers. It never crossed her mind that he might not recognize her. She'd arrived a little late, just as Tayo was being introduced, and he'd glanced at her briefly, without recognition, as she slipped quietly into one of the back rows. Only at the end of his talk, when she stood up, did he really see her. "Vanessa!" he exclaimed, and everyone turned to look. "I'll be right back," she called, not knowing what else to do but run out and gather her composure. Now, standing in the privacy of the ladies' toilet, Vanessa looked into the mirror. She placed both hands flat against her forehead and pulled. This way, she was able to hide the grey and take away the wrinkles, but when she removed her hands, everything popped back. The grey hairs and furrows that ran along her forehead and spread like fine cat's whiskers from the corner of each eye. She shook her head and sighed. Then, startled by a sharp knock on the door, she dropped the compact she was holding and watched as a powdery plume of blue and purple eyeshadow billowed across the floor. "Just a minute," she called, bending down to pick up the broken bits. The powder crumbled when touched, so she used her foot to kick what she could out of sight beneath the sink. Quickly, she washed her hands and opened the door, but whomever had knocked had left. She returned to the seminar room where people still waited in line to meet Tayo and have their book signed. She smiled, calmer now, watching him interact, ever gracious and charming. He had only a sprinkling of white hair. He'd barely aged. He looked just as handsome as she remembered, though not quite as fashionable. He wore grey trousers, a little flared at the ankles, and a cream-coloured shirt with a wide collar. He looked up from where he sat and gestured for her not to leave. "Take your time," she gestured back, taking a mint from her bag, as well as a notebook. Usually the latter would have been filled with her scribbles capturing what the speaker had said, their style of presentation, the questions and responses, but today she'd been too distracted to write. What would they say to each other? What would she say? She jumped in surprise when he touched her shoulder. She hadn't seen him coming. "Vanessa," he said, catching her before she tripped. "How wonderful to see you." "And you," she said, steadying herself. You... They spoke simultaneously, stopped, then tried again. The same thing happened. For some minutes they stood awkwardly, Tayo still holding onto her arms, each of them saying how good the other looked. "Dinner?" Tayo finally said, only then gently letting go of her. "There's a nice Indian place not far from here." "So, where do we start?" "It's been 20 years. More than." Tayo began as they left the building, stepping into early evening sunshine. Their arms kept bumping into each other. Vanessa stepped back to give them more space. "More than 20, Vanessa nodded. "You left in 66 and I came in." She paused, making it sound as though she were just working it out. 27 years, Tayo said. "And now you're married. Do you have children?" "I have a son." "And?" Tayo held out his hand. Vanessa wasn't sure whether he was offering her his hand or whether it was simply a gesture. She chose to ignore his hand, looking across the street, waiting for the lights to turn so that they could cross. "And where did you meet your husband?" he asked, his hands now in his pockets. "How old is your son? I want to know everything." "Everything?" She raised her eyebrows, feeling suddenly irritated by his words. Did he think he could simply waltz back into her life and ask whatever he wished? She thought of their first 2 years apart, and how they'd felt, at the time, like the worst years of her life. Did he know? Of course he didn't. "I got a job with The Guardian," she said simply. "I didn't realize you worked with them as early as that." "Yes, but in the beginning it wasn't as a journalist." "What were you doing?" "Oh, making tea mainly, lots of tea," she smiled, "and being paraded about at lunches by my boss. I should never have stayed, but I was young and naive." "I'd forgotten how much I love your smile," he said. They'd come to another junction in the road, waiting for the lights to change. He had the same broad shoulders, she noticed, and for a moment she was tempted to touch him, just slip a hand behind his back and rest it on his shoulder, like old times. "I've missed you too," she wanted to say, but couldn't bring herself to. Her desire was tinged with resentment and anger. "And your laugh," he added. "I've missed that as well." "How is your family?" she asked. It was an awkward transition, but he didn't seem to mind. He told her about his daughter and her chosen field of study, of how she'd gravitated toward drama or music when architecture was what he'd hoped she would study. "Why not something in the arts?" Vanessa asked. "It's hypocritical of me, isn't it?" he nodded. "But it's so hard to be an artist in Africa these days. You must know. To be honest, I just don't want my daughter to be discouraged when she returns home." "If she returns?" Vanessa added. "Yes," he nodded. "I suppose one can never take these things for granted, and to be honest, I don't think she will." Vanessa noticed the frequency with which he said, "to be honest," the irony of it. "But look, I'm doing all the talking. Tell me about you, Vanessa. And how are your parents? Mum, she was sorry to inform him, had died some years earlier from cancer. Father was fine, just getting old. She asked him about his family and was sorry to hear that he too had lost his mother. And your husband? Who's the lucky man? She knew he would ask, but it didn't make it any easier. Well, actually, you know him, she said. It's Edward. Edward Barker. If Tayo was shocked, he did a better job of disguising it than she did of trying to make things sound less awkward. She told him about Edward's divorce and Isabella's return to Italy. She felt compelled to make it clear that nothing had ever happened between them when they had been at Oxford. It was only by chance, she explained, that she met Edward years later in London after she'd returned from Dakar. She had not told Edward that she would be seeing Tayo, and she was glad that Tayo didn't ask. You must tell me about your time in Dakar, Tayo said, changing the subject. That was when I started reading your articles, all those fantastic pieces on Senghor, Usman and Ba. It must have been wonderful. You know I've been following your career closely, Vanessa. Have you? She turned to better face him. Do you remember when you asked me, while we were at Oxford, what I thought of you becoming an African journalist? I do. And now you're Africa's favourite writer. I have a file at home with all of your articles, at least those I could get hold of in Nigeria. She had followed his career too. It was her job to keep track of African artists and scholars, but in Tayo's case, she would have done it anyway. Here we are, he said, pointing to the restaurant. As they approached, the smell of curry reminded Vanessa of Tayo's New Year's culinary experiment. The smell of curry always reminded her of him. She was about to tell him so when she remembered that it had been in Edward's old house, and she said nothing. You know, the first piece I read of yours was that article on Festac, Tayo continued as they sat down. It was a superb article. You were critical of the organisers, and you used Fela's zombie lyrics so powerfully to make your point. Yes, she nodded, remembering her initial excitement at being in Nigeria, where she'd kept hoping to run into Tayo. So you never went to Festac? He shook his head. A waiter had arrived to deposit glasses of water and a basket full of papadums. She broke a papadum and handed half to Tayo. Doesn't this remind you of Oxford? Tayo smiled. She nodded. What was the name of that Indian place we went to? Viceroy's or Raj, I think it was. Something with a colonial ring. Tayo tapped his forehead to remember. The Taj. Ah, that's right, he laughed, longer than was necessary. The conversation had grown awkward again, and Vanessa wished the waiter had given them more time before returning to announce their choice of condiments. Mango chutney, spicy sauce and yogurt. You must tell me more about the books you write for children, she said, searching for a neutral topic of conversation. Initially inspired by you, Vanessa. Really? You gave me a first edition copy of Winnie the Pooh, remember? Well, that was what started me thinking about children's literature. But I want to know more about you. Are you still in touch with friends from St. Hugh's? I've been to a few Gaudies, but other than that, I don't really stay in touch. She didn't feel like saying more. She was happy to see him, but sad and irritated with him at the same time. It bothered her that he seemed so calm. She wasn't hungry anymore. And Jane? He asked. The last I heard, she'd married a rich American and was living somewhere in California. We haven't stayed in touch. And you? What about the Balliol crowd? No, I'm not in touch with many of them, except for what I've read through the record. But the other day I found one of my notebooks. I don't think I ever told you this, but I used to keep a record of all the titled people I met at Oxford. I did it for my father, but the funny thing is that most of the names I wrote down became nothing, or not famous in any case. And you, my friend Vanessa, have become the most famous of all. Oh, don't be silly, she said, forcing a smile. But it's true. So I wasn't in your book of names? You were so much in my head, Vanessa, that I didn't need to write your name down. She broke off a piece of papadum, aware that he was watching her. She wished he wouldn't. Papadum bits burst inelegantly from her mouth. He hadn't touched his. I was so much in your head that you found someone else, she ventured. He looked down at his plate as two waiters now struggled to find room on the table for the various platters of rice and chicken. In the end, Vanessa removed the large vase of plastic carnations, impatient for the waiters to leave. I was young then, he spoke quietly, keeping his eyes fixed on the food. Well, to Tayo, she said finally, lifting her glass. To Vanessa, he clinked his glass against hers. She helped herself from the plate he was offering. The rice clung stubbornly to the plate, so she pressed harder. Tayo's grip on the plate remained firm. I've missed you, Vanessa. Silence hung uncomfortably between them, and just when it looked like he might say more, someone broke the silence for them. It's you, Tayo, exclaimed the man who was striding across the room towards them. Look at you, old chap. You don't recognize me, do you? It's me, Samir, from Bradford, remember? For several moments, in their excitement to see each other, the men seemed to have forgotten that Vanessa was there. I'm sorry, Mum. Tayo, is this your wife? Samir turned to Vanessa, curious. This is my friend, Vanessa Richardson, Tayo replied. She writes for The Guardian. Not another of your girlfriends, then? Samir laughed, slapping Tayo across the shoulder in friendly greeting. Don't mind if I join you, do you? He pulled up a chair from a neighbouring table. So, tell us, Tayo, what's going on with this country of yours? Any real chance of returning to civilian rule? Who knows, Tayo replied, glancing at Vanessa. Still waiting for your Nehru dynasty? Samir laughed. And I mean, just look at what a bloody mess India has got herself in now. What to do? Bloody power-hungry, all of them. And I thought you were bound for politics, old chap. What happened? No, not politics, I teach, Tayo said, sending an apologetic look to Vanessa. Ah, well, that's wise then, old chap. So look, where is your wife? She's here, well, not here, Tayo added, but in London. Doing the holiday shopping, is she? No, she lives here now, and my daughter too. My wife runs a nursing facility for the elderly. Oh, then you must all come to visit. I have 3 daughters now, you know. Excuse me, Vanessa said, standing up. Tayo looked up, anxious, but Vanessa wouldn't look at him. She was angry with Samir for interrupting them, and annoyed with Tayo for letting the man stay. She went in search of the restaurant phone and left a message for Edward, letting him know she'd be late. She contemplated a cigarette, but it had been years since she last smoked. She went to the ladies' room instead, and fiddled with her hair, straightening the side parting. What am I doing here? She muttered to the mirror. She returned to their table and told Tayo she had a train to catch. Samir offered to drive her to the station. She told him it wasn't necessary. Samir insisted. Now what? Vanessa thought, staring angrily at the empty tracks as she and Tayo stood, finally alone at Birmingham New Street. A rat scurried along one of the metal girders. Vanessa closed her eyes and sighed. You're angry with me, aren't you? Tayo touched her arm. Angry? Vanessa asked, knowing she was no good at pretending. I'm sorry about Samir. It's not your fault. I meant what I said when I told you I'd missed you, Vanessa, Tayo said. And I'm sorry, very sorry for the way things ended between us. Not that it means anything now, but I loved you, Vanessa. I always did. Yes, she sighed, for what was the point in being angry? It was too late for that now. She reached for his hand, half clutching at his fingers and half stroking them. He stepped closer, just as her train arrived, bringing their joined hands up to his heart. May I kiss you? He whispered. I'll miss my train, Tayo, she said, gently squeezing his hands before letting go. Chapter 28. Vanessa sat in the grass at the top of Brockwell Park, looking down towards Herne Hill Station. It had been 2 weeks since she'd seen Tayo, but memories of the dinner, the waiting at the station, and his offer of a kiss still lingered in her mind. She tried picturing him back in Nigeria, in his office or at home, but found herself always returning to his room in Oxford, or the offices at Cheikh Anta Diop, which was her only model for a West African campus. She wondered what he would think of where she now lived and the life she'd created for herself. Herne Hill used to be nothing fancy, just another nondescript borough of southeast London, with rows of Victorian terraced homes, a local pub, bank, newsagent, and a post office. But things were changing. It started in 1990 with 2 new art shops, first the one under the station bridge, and then Artemidorus on Half Moon Lane. Next came the French bistros and an ultra-pricey Indian fusion restaurant. Now, cluttered around the station, were expensive shops and eating places, marking Herne Hill as part of the new South London, trendy but not gentrified. There remained enough of the old Herne Hill to prevent it from becoming a second Dulwich. The bakery, for example, hadn't changed. It still sold greasy sausage rolls and stodgy buns drizzled with confectioner's sugar, topped with glacé cherries. It had some new competition from the Jamaican patty across the street, tastier fare, but still not upmarket. Then there was the Nigerian man with his clothes shop that was also a tailoring business and also offered secretarial services. It was hard to tell which of its operations was core, especially as it was almost never open, in contrast to its neighbour, the 24-hour taxi rank. Stations Taxis was a seedy shack of a place that reeked of tobacco, even more than the pub across the street. Many of the drivers were Nigerian, which meant she could never pass it without thinking of Tayo. She stretched her legs, enjoying the tickle of grass beneath her calves. Down at the bottom of the hill, men and women were cleaning the park. They wore plastic sleeves and used long stick devices to pick up discarded beer cans, paper plates and plastic knives and forks. Yesterday, the annual Brockwell Park Fair had taken place, and hundreds of Londoners had trampled across the grass, eating, drinking and dropping their litter. She had come by herself. It wasn't the sort of thing Edward enjoyed. Too raucous, he'd complained. Her son, Suleiman, had come, but not with her. He went with friends to flirt with the girls and no doubt smoke some hash. And so, with Edward at home and Suleiman out of sight, she had wandered from store to store, sampling West African cuisine and buying things to support local artists. As usual, when the African vendors learnt that she'd lived on their continent, she was greeted with added enthusiasm. Suleiman laughed at her whenever she said she felt more at home with Africans than with the English, but it was true. There was a saying that once you tasted the waters of Africa, you would always thirst for more, and she was ready to return. She'd left Dakar in 1975, when her mother was very ill. Had it not been for this, and the subsequent need to help father adjust to living alone, she might never have come back to live in England. Her years in Africa, most of them at least, were the happiest of her life. The sun always shone, and she'd felt fulfilled in her work. In Dakar, she had never worried about how to raise her son, and she was never alone, but here, even though she had Edward to help, mothering was a lonely job. Suleiman, in his early 20s, was a very different child from Suleiman as a boy. The charming, chatty toddler was gone, replaced by a silent, troubled young man. Other mothers empathized, blaming it on his relative youth, but she knew what they really thought. That's the problem with having a black child. Vanessa brought her knees to her chest and hugged them. The park cleaners had gone, and down by the station, stick-like figures scurried in and out. Rush hour had begun, and some of those returning from work would leave the station and walk back to Brixton, or up to Herne Hill and Dulwich. She and Edward lived on Herne Hill Road, not far from St. Paul's Church. Goodness, she gasped, suddenly remembering. Today was their anniversary. She'd never been good at remembering these dates, but it was strange that Edward had also forgotten. 18 years of marriage, she contemplated, and not to Tayo or another African, as she had once envisaged, but to Edward. Edward Maximilian Barker. After things had ended with Tayo, Vanessa had deliberately stayed away from all of Tayo's old friends, including the Barkers. But one day, in the autumn of 1968, she'd bumped into Edward in London, and they'd had lunch together. Edward had seen how miserable she was and encouraged her to return to Dakar. The problem with returning, however, was that she had no job to go to. When she first went to Senegal, she'd gone on a whim and stayed with one of Uncle Tony's friends in St. Louis. There was no thought of finding a job. It was just an escape from England and from her family, with a desire to be somehow closer to Tayo, despite her anger. Then, when she couldn't escape her despair in Senegal, she'd returned to England, thinking she'd throw herself back into her studies. But she hadn't been able to do that either. Instead, she drifted for a year, doing casual jobs in London, until the day she met Edward. He had given her names and addresses of friends at Cheikh Anta Diop, and, thanks to him, she'd left her job and returned to Senegal to start a new life. In Dakar, nobody knew about her sadness, and only Salamatu was aware of Tayo, and she only knew a little. And then she too was gone, killed in a car accident on a treacherous stretch of the road between Dakar and St. Louis. For weeks afterwards, nobody could console Vanessa, although Edward, on his many visits, tried his best, and his presence did bring her comfort. For a time, Edward became like a father to Vanessa, a man far wiser, gentler, and more self-possessed than the men of Vanessa's own age. Above all, he listened. And yes, she knew that he was attracted to her in more than just a friendly way, but she chose to ignore it. He also wasn't her type, too old and far too English in his way of speaking, his dress, and his mannerisms. She had said no the first time he asked her to marry him, but several months later, when he proposed again, she'd managed to convince herself that her initial reservations were foolish. He was, after all, her closest friend, and it seemed only natural that they should marry. July 15th, 1977, 18 years. She'd grown to love him, but those things that she hadn't liked in the beginning never went away, and the attraction of his older age soon disappeared. Now he was forgetful and prone to repeating stories. In his retirement, he spent hours in his men's clubs with his very English friends. He smoked and drank and talked incessantly of holiday homes in the south of France. He no longer thirsted for Africa. And then there was something else, so small and trivial that it bothered Vanessa that she even noticed it. Yet it was worse than all the other irritations and always there. His smell. It cloaked the house and seeped into everything they owned, clothes, curtains, the bedding, a horrible, acrid smell like old, musty books, only worse, the smell of old age and far too similar to that of her father. "Darling Vanessa," someone called. "Anthony," she smiled, turning around to find her friend from Sketchley standing before her. Something about Anthony reminded her of Abubakar. Both were charming, and she knew they found her attractive, but only in an exotic sort of way. In Abubakar's case, she had been the young English visitor to Senegal. In those days, she could be considered beautiful, but surely to Abubakar the greatest attraction had been her naivety. She'd been too stupid to realize that he was already married. There was no naivety with Anthony, at least not on her part, but she could see that he was taken by the idea of an older English woman with an interesting past life in Africa. "What gwine on, beauty?" Anthony dropped the plastic bag that he was carrying and sat next to her on the grass. "Where you dey yesterday? Me I look for you, child." "I was here for a while," she smiled. "What you thinking today? What you gonna write?" "Right now I'm working on a piece about recent immigrants to London, African immigrants." "And what about their Jamaican brethren?" Anthony joked. "We is the original diaspora true. Besides, you have fee I name in the articles them. Do me some free advertising. Anthony Sketchley on Railton Road, best dry cleaners in a London." She laughed and tugged at his Walkman, asking him what he was listening to as he removed his headphones and placed them round her head. "Hugh Masekela," she smiled, recognizing the song. "Yeah, man," he nodded, lying back in the grass and closing his eyes. His shirt had risen above his stomach, revealing a ladder of taut muscles. His hands were linked across his chest, and the long, dark fingers reminded Vanessa of Tayo's. But Anthony was young, not much older than Suleiman. Therefore, however much this man might thrill her, she had to stop imagining things. She listened to Masekela's song for Mandela, remembering the year it first came out, and how she'd played it continuously on the day Mandela was released. She smiled and looked down the path to where a couple were walking slowly up the hill. The man pushed a pram and the woman hugged the man's waist, leaning gently on his side, a black and white couple. Vanessa turned away so that she wouldn't have to nod, and smiled as the couple walked by. Hearing her move, Anthony opened his eyes and sat up. "So you want get a drink?" he offered. When Vanessa got home, Edward was playing Rachmaninoff at a deafening volume. "Oh, for God's sake, you're worse than Suleiman," Vanessa shouted above the music before switching it off. Edward wasn't in the lounge, which meant he was upstairs having a bath. Sometimes he fell asleep there. "One day you'll bloody drown," she muttered, stomping up the stairs. "Hello, darling." He met her on the landing. "Will you please not play your music so loudly, Edward? I thought you rather liked Rachmaninoff, my love." "Frankly, I'd much prefer Hugh Masekela any day," she snapped. "Who's that, my love?" "Oh, never mind," she said, brushing past him. He was growing deaf as well. "Darling, let me give you a kiss. It's our anniversary." "I know," she said, flinging open the windows in their bedroom. "Are you hot, darling?" "No, it's stuffy." She strode out of their room, back to where he stood. He was slouched a little against the banister, and that was when she noticed the bruise on his head. "What happened?" she asked, reaching to touch. "Oh, it's just a little bump. I couldn't find my glasses and tripped on the carpet, but it's nothing. Come, I've got something to show you." He held out his hand and she followed him to the study. She slipped an arm around his waist, ashamed of herself for being so sharp with him. "I went to the bookshop while you were out and bought this for you." "Oh, darling," she exclaimed, seeing the photograph of Mandela on the book's cover and knowing immediately what it was. "I thought you'd like it," he smiled. Long Walk to Freedom. She read the title. The book had only just come out. Where had he managed to find a copy so quickly? She opened it and read on the inside cover the note that Edward had written. "To the woman I love, and with whom I have walked the best 18 years of my life." Oh, Edward. She put the book down and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist. Chapter 29. He still found it hard to believe that after all these years they'd seen each other again. But their time had been too short. He'd wanted to say more, to have talked about what happened, to have tried to explain. He tried now to say these things in a letter, but couldn't find the words, so what was he going to do? He would just have to try harder, write without worrying how it came out, without the emotion being burdened by explanations. The most important thing was to stay in touch. So perhaps he would start by telling her about Nigeria, about how things had gone from bad to worse. He would tell her about the schools and hospitals that were closed and the civil servants that had not been paid. But this was all too depressing. He would perhaps try to make light of the situation and joke about the fact that the two most lucrative businesses were theft and security. Only this wasn't much of a joke. So what would he write? Write, he told himself. Just write. July 1995. Dear Vanessa, since our meeting, I have given further thought to our discussion on the role of the artist, finding myself going back to some of the readings we debated at Oxford, in particular James Baldwin and Ezekiel Mfalele. Do you remember those long nights when we used to talk about their ideas? I have found it so interesting to reread their works and to discover things I had missed on a first read. I was particularly struck this time by Baldwin's musing on what constitutes a healthy society. What is the role of the maverick or dissenter in a cohesive society? A question I ask myself. Where exactly do I fit? So often I feel out of place, and by this I'm not referring to my stance against the government. I consider my political dissension to be a necessity rather than the actions of a misfit, given that the majority of us believe the same thing. What I mean when I speak of not fitting in has to do with the cultural sense of non-belonging. Would she think him crazy to be writing this? Would she understand? For example, I don't always comply with the demands of extended family, and I'm no longer certain about the existence of a God. These are both fundamental elements in our culture that one is not supposed to question. I also find that I tire of social interaction in a way that is deemed unacceptable to most people here. And this is where one of Mfalele's essays seems particularly insightful to me now. I referred to the fabric of African cultures, which is an exposé of the so-called elements that make up the African personality. These characteristics are obviously generalizations, but I believe they still ring true for much of the continent, even now, 20 years after the essay was written. Mfalele speaks of the importance we attach to extended family, communal responsibility, and reverence for ancestral spirits, all of which I fail miserably on. But it is his last observation that particularly struck me this time round. Mfalele speaks of the cultural tendency to gravitate towards other people rather than towards things and places. This is something I was only subliminally aware of until I read the essay. In a way, things, such as books filled with ideas, and places, memories of places and destinations yet to be visited, are what captivate me more than people. I'm not saying that people are unimportant, especially friends like you, but I notice that I do not automatically seek company in the same way as those around me when they have something on their mind. What, then, is my African personality? Goodness, Tayo muttered. I'm not sure if I'm making much sense, and to be honest, I'm not sure I know what I want to say. Perhaps I simply wish to express how much I enjoyed our conversation and to share with you how it has set me thinking. If only daily life in Nigeria left more time for tranquil reflection. What he did not say, and what he was only just realizing, was that he had missed having someone to talk to. Sometimes he would talk with his colleagues and some of his students, but it had been years since he had shared ideas about life so openly and honestly with anyone. London, July 1995. Dear Tayo, it was lovely to hear from you, but I'm alarmed to hear of your detention. You do not mention it in your letter, but I have heard from others. Is it true? Promise me, Tayo, that you will be careful for your sake and your family's. The fact that you are known abroad may offer you some protection from military interference, but not much, Tayo. Look at what is happening to Ken Saro-Wiwa. You must be careful. I'm so concerned by what I hear from Nigeria these days, and angry that our government won't do more to condemn the corruption and human rights violations. Please, Tayo, promise me you'll be careful. You asked me about work, and yes, I'm still with The Guardian, but finding the job increasingly frustrating. When will serious attention ever be given to Africa? There was so much optimism when the Cold War ended, and I had such hopes that African nations might finally be treated with respect. But this hasn't happened, and it continues to be a struggle here publishing articles on Africa. I'm forced to play silly games, writing at weekends or at times when certain difficult editors are away, to ensure publication. I'm nostalgic for the days in Dakar and restless here in England. Perhaps I'm also a misfit. I live here, yet don't feel particularly English. What then is my personality, African, European, or Afropean? Is this restlessness the price we pay for having lived in other countries and tasted other cultures? And yet, there are many people who've lived and travelled in various places who still seem most at home in their country of birth. I don't know what it is, Tayo. Do people like us just think about these things too much? I also wrestle with the question of who can write about Africa. Do I still have the right to report on African affairs now that I no longer live on the continent? Did I earn the right when I was there? I often think back to that Oxford Union debate and what Malcolm X said about foreign correspondence in Africa. I also wonder about this notion of the insider and outsider that we once discussed in France. Do you remember? To what extent does being an outsider allow a person unique insights into a culture? To what extent might the outside status blind rather than illuminate? And then, at what point does one cease to be an outsider? So now you have set me thinking too. I would like to hear more about your views on faith and the church. I find it ironic that we seem to have moved in opposite directions on this topic. I now attend church regularly. It gives me a sense of belonging and a feeling of peace. You say that Nigerian society expects one to believe, whereas British society almost presumes the opposite. Could it be that our societies have driven us to our respective points of belief and unbelief? My son recently joined the Muslim faith, which has grown increasingly popular here among young black men. They say that Islam brings a sense of purpose and discipline, but I have yet to see it in Suleiman. It has been a difficult year. Suleiman left university in April, just before finals. We don't know why, and he won't talk to us about it. He was doing so well, but now he's unemployed and living with friends in North London. Edward thinks we should let him do as he wishes, but I find it hard. We used to be so close, and now it's as though we're strangers. I feel guilty for not being a good enough mother. Perhaps I focused too much on my career and not spent enough time with Suleiman. It's at times like this that I miss my own mother. I miss her all of the time, of course, but especially now. I would have gone to her for advice, or perhaps simply sympathy or empathy. I don't know, Tayo. Perhaps it's always hard for mothers and fathers. Please be careful, Tayo, and stay in touch. Love, Vanessa. November 1995. My dear Vanessa, you are a wonderful mother, and Suleiman knows this. It is just a stage that he's going through, and it will pass, you will see. You must not feel guilty. I know that finding the balance is hard, but I'm very proud of you for being so good a mother, as well as a writer dedicated to this continent. I'm also touched that you are concerned for my well-being, but I'm fine. You mustn't worry. I was detained for the so-called offence of showing my students Perry Hensel's film, The Harder They Come. It was deemed subversive, but I was released shortly thereafter. It was no big thing, and I promise you that I'm taking care of myself. Since I last wrote, Miriam has been back, but things have sadly not gone well. We both tried in our own way to see each other's point of view, but it wasn't enough. Last month, I decided that I must move to England for the sake of the family, but by then it was too late. Miriam is asking for a divorce. The very word, divorce, makes me feel so ashamed. How could I have failed my wife and daughter like this? If anyone should feel guilty about placing profession before family, it is me. He wanted to tell her more, to tell her about Hawa and how she had been the last straw for Miriam. He wanted to tell Vanessa, as he would any close friend, how he'd struggled with the affair, not wanting to start it from the beginning. But what was he thinking? He couldn't possibly share this with Vanessa. I only wish I had faith, Vanessa. I really do. I still pray sometimes, but I lack the conviction that anyone hears, let alone answers my prayers. Kemi blames me for what happened, and no doubt rightly so. When she was a child, we discussed all sorts of things together, and I would tell her stories, but now we hardly speak. Things have certainly been difficult for her, even without the added strain of what has happened between Miriam and me. Kemi did her degree in African Studies and Art History, which, I'm afraid, has made it hard for her to find a good job. For the time being, she is working as a secretary in London. She says she wants to return to Africa and to teach English as a second language, but this is not the time to do such things. Nowhere, with the exception, perhaps, of Zimbabwe and Botswana, and neither of these countries need ESL, are conditions in this continent stable enough. She has also mentioned going to America, but I'm afraid I'm not keen on that either. America is so far from Nigeria. She speaks of doing something in the arts, setting up an African art gallery or some such thing. Do you think there are prospects for this in the UK? She complains of racism in England, but surely America is worse. I tried to bring Kemi up to be her own person, to be an independent young woman. I didn't want to raise her the way I was raised, but maybe in the process I failed to give her enough direction. I'm sorry, Vanessa. I don't mean to complain. I think of you so often and wonder how you are. I miss you. Yours lovingly, Tayo. Chapter 30. Vanessa stared at her computer, thinking of Tayo's most recent letters. She had remembered something that her mother once told her about love, and now she tried to remember when the conversation had taken place, deciding it must have been late in the summer of 1967. They'd been sitting in the garden, she with a book on her lap, and Mother doing cross-stitch. It was one of those rare, warm English summers. Mother could have been telling any story. The mere cadence of her voice was enough to soothe. But it wasn't just any old story. In retrospect, Vanessa wished she'd asked more questions, but at the time she could only think of how things related to her and Tayo. Now she wondered what the story might have meant to Mother, and who might have told Mother this story. Her mother had told her that there was a saying amongst the Hausa that a person never married their first love. A person always married someone else, but later in life that person would be reunited with their first love. The Hausa apparently even had a phrase for it. They called it the pick-up-your-stick-and-sandals marriage, which referred to the way that an old man would go and visit his childhood sweetheart later in life. The woman cooked, the man brought presents, and then they shared companionship. Pick up your stick and sandals, Vanessa repeated to herself, hitting the space key to banish the silly, animated fish that floated across her screen every time she stopped working. In large letters at the top of the page popped the title, Shona Art, Stunning Sculpture from Zimbabwe Takes Art World by Storm. Her fingers lingered on the keys. If father was indeed mother's first love, what did the Hausa say for those who married first loves only to be disappointed later in life? And what did other African cultures have to say about romantic love? She hit the space key again. The article was due the next day, and she'd been wasting time. She would begin with a brief history of Frank McEwen at the National Gallery of Rhodesia and his role in encouraging art in the 1950s. Then she would describe Tom Bloomfield and the establishment of the Tengenenge community in the 1960s, paying special attention to Agnes Nyanongo and Colleen Madamombe. More on women sculptors, she made a mental note. She shook her hair out of its loose ponytail, rolled her chair closer to the desk, and placed her fingers back on the keys. At a time when reports from Africa are dominated by famine, starvation, and AIDS, Shona Art holds a promise of... She didn't want to start like this, but it seemed the only way to move the reader on from the pervasive images of naked, skeletal Africans with flies buzzing around their faces. Or was it? This dilemma always presented itself. Was she, in fact, perpetuating stereotypes by mentioning them, or was she helping readers to see past the clichés? And who was her audience these days? British lefties, immigrants, African students, or all three? She stared absently at the screen, wondering if she should abandon the whole thing. Eventually she stood up and went to the kitchen. There she poured herself some wine, and as she drank she peered into the cupboards, thinking she should eat, not just drink. She found tins of baked beans, high-fibre soups, packets of pasta and dried mushrooms that Edward always kept on hand. On another shelf were his box of bran flakes and her Swiss muesli. Nothing caught her fancy, so she wandered into the lounge, leaving her glass behind. The balloons from Saturday's party were still stuck to the ceiling. One popped as she opened the French windows to catch some fresh air. The room smelt of old wine and cigarettes. Outside it was still drizzling. She poured another drink, holding the bottle with one hand and tapping its skinny neck with her wedding band. This was the real English summer, grey and rainy. What a dismal country. She turned back to the room and saw that the wind had blown off most of the cards from the bookshelves and mantelpiece. Saturday had been another of Edward's surprises. He was good at this, but she didn't like the unexpected anymore, especially not when it involved lots of people. She'd secretly hoped that he might surprise her differently. He might have cooked or taken her for a ride in the country, just the two of them. Of course she had smiled all evening, suffering and smiling. She played the required role, saying how blessed she felt, how wonderful it was to turn 50, what nonsense. But all the time she was wishing she could disappear. Edward had bought her several CDs, picking the music he thought she liked. The best of Sarah Vaughan, the best of Miles Davis. She hated best-ofs. Suleiman had asked her what she wanted for her birthday, and had taken her at her word when she said nothing, presenting her with a token bunch of wilting flowers, still wrapped in crinkly Tesco paper marked Summer Special, £4.99. He might as well just have picked something from the garden. At least that would have shown originality. And then they'd parted so badly when she'd driven him to the airport. "Well, you drive then," she'd finally shouted after Suleiman kept complaining about her driving. "I should never have let you take me anyway," he grumbled. "I was perfectly happy catching the tube." And it was true. He had not wanted her to drive him to Heathrow, but she felt that as a mother she ought to. He was going to Senegal for an indefinite period of time. Of course she would take him. "You never wanted me to do this trip anyway." "I'm happy you're going, Suleiman, but it's just the timing. You haven't finished university, and what happens when you return?" "Who said I'm coming back?" "Oh, don't be so ridiculous." "Oh, fuck you, Mum." "What?" She slammed her foot against the brakes, skidding onto the hard shoulder. "How dare you speak to your mother like that?" "Mother? What mother? Did you think you were doing some nice charity work for Africa when you decided to adopt me?" She set off again, speeding this time. If that was how he felt, then fuck him too. She would drop him and leave. "You just thought you'd take me out of Africa, didn't you? And turn me into some middle-class bourgeois project. You thought you could send me to Oxford or Cambridge and I'd come out looking like you or Dad, collecting nice art from Africa, writing nice stories about Africa. Well, that's fucked up. I'm going back to learn about where I came from and to mix with my Muslim brothers and sisters, a place where Islam is respected and revered and not mocked like it is in this fucking place." "Well, go then," she shouted. "But remember, I adopted you because I love you, because your mum was my best friend and I promised Salamatu to take care of you. Call me your bourgeois parents if that makes you feel better, but I've never, ever tried to mould you into anything." And then it was silence all the way until just before he went through security. With tears in her eyes, she watched him disappear, her tall, handsome son, and all the phases of his life flashed by, the day that Salamatu had died, and the years that followed in Dakar, them making toys together out of cardboard boxes and empty fairy liquid bottles, swimming in the sea, nursing him back to health after his fevers, leaving for England to see Grandma before she died, when Suleiman had been ecstatic to travel for the first time on an aeroplane. He had loved England then, the changing seasons, fish and chips, Cadbury's chocolates, and his new school. Even the teenage years hadn't been difficult, but then came university. She worried constantly about him, especially now that he was so far away. What were Tayo's words? "It is a stage he is going through and it will pass, you will see." She longed for Tayo now. She stood up, closed the back door, and stared for a moment at the wine bottle on the shelf. She left it where it stood, empty between the fallen cards. She'd received 2 letters from Tayo yesterday. In one he'd asked about her faith. "Tell you about my faith?" she mumbled to herself. How can I speak of it when I'm like this? She covered her face with her hands. Look at me now, just look at me. But in his letter he'd also mentioned the possibility of a visit, and with that thought she lifted her hands from her face, flicked away the tears, and began to write. My dear Tayo, if only you knew what happens when your letters arrive. If only you knew. There was a letter you wrote to me in 1967, the letter we both avoided talking about when we saw each other last. Have you ever imagined the pain it caused me? Had it not been for Mother, but I will tell you one day. And now you have written again, and I am filled with despair, depression perhaps, although I hate the word depression, so gloomy and self-indulgent. I'm sure I never once heard the word used in Africa. There was no time to be depressed. Of course people had their anxieties, but it wasn't spoken of as it is here in Europe. Perhaps when depression is discussed, scrutinized, it leads to more of it. But today your letter has lifted my spirits, and as I think of you, I try to imagine what life would be like with you. Do you sometimes think the same? I tell myself that you do, but then I fear that this is just what married people use as an escape. Perhaps we all cling to fantasies of some other person that allow us to keep going with our day-to-day lives. I wonder if this is what my parents did. Father always working, mother drinking. There must have been something else in their lives, some hope. And now, when I look at myself, it's not that anything is terribly wrong, but I long to be in love again. I want passion, to be with you. I wonder if you have ever come across the saying, a pick up your stick and sandals marriage. This was what Mother called it. I don't know where she heard it or whether it even exists, but she said it was a Hausa belief that in later age one is reunited with one's first love. Perhaps it was just a story to console the lovelorn. I know that everything would not be pure bliss between us, no marriage ever is, but I like to dream, and when have I not? I was born with a restlessness in my soul, the restlessness of an artist who is never fully satisfied. One moment I long to be surrounded by friends, and in another I'm wishing to be alone, far away from anyone I know. Is this me being selfish, or is it simply a function of growing old? I certainly don't recall feeling this way in my 20s or 30s. So you see, when you ask me about faith, I'm hardly the person to talk. My faith is weak. I strive to be closer to God, to release myself from self-centeredness, but with little success. The issue of suffering that you raised in your last letter has always bothered me, always. Vanessa stopped and highlighted the text. She paused, then pressed delete. Chapter 31. Rain fell lightly from all directions, like fine sifted flour, being shaken from the heavens. This was England, Sussex to be precise, in the middle of summer. Joy, the Zimbabwean care worker, opened the front door and nodded without speaking as she let Vanessa in. Not for the first time did Vanessa wonder how a person so dour-looking could be so named. The lack of communication with joyless Joy bothered Vanessa. Usually others warmed to her, and especially Africans who were always delighted by the mere fact that she knew so much about their continent. But perhaps it was not fair to blame Joy. Working in such a place was bound to squeeze out every last bit of joy from a person. The Carrington home for the elderly had a steamed-up feel, warm and stuffy, like a second-hand clothing shop, with the added lingering smells of Sunday roast, disinfectant, and urine. When Vanessa arrived, 3 people sat in the lounge. Father, Mrs. Halliday slouched in her chair fast asleep, and dear old Nancy Murdoch, who had moved to the home at the same time as Father. Nancy followed Father everywhere with her Zimmer frame, even though most of the time she didn't remember who he was. Father had long since stopped paying attention to her, but she never noticed, always mumbling to herself regardless. Father was the only one active at that moment, bent over his armchair and rummaging through his briefcase. The case would be empty, but he would still be searching for something, a handkerchief, pencil, fountain pen, or some other item that he would soon ask Vanessa to find. "Hello, Daddy." "Fancy that," Nancy muttered. "Is that you, darling?" Father looked up briefly to squint in her direction. "I can't find my pen, darling. Have you brought me some more?" "No, Daddy, but I'm sure we'll find you one in your bedroom." It still shocked Vanessa to see her father like this, with his collar uneven and bits of breakfast lodged between his teeth. She sat down at the edge of a chair that stank of urine and used her fingertips to remove a wad of pink toilet paper from Father's hands. There was something horrible stuck to the paper that she dared not inspect. This was an expensive residential home, yet sometimes one had to wonder where all the money went. "Daddy, have you got your hearing aid in?" "No, he doesn't," Nancy replied for him. "Thank you, Nancy," Vanessa nodded, as she would to a child who'd given the right answer. Perhaps not as demented as we all think, she thought to herself, as she went to her father's room and found his hearing aid under the bed. On most days, Vanessa said little to her father. She cut his nails and listened patiently to his complaints. But today, when he suggested that Mary and all the other black caregivers be sent back to where they came from, she'd had enough. "Will you come back tomorrow to shave my whiskers?" Father asked, as she stood up to leave. "No, Daddy, I'm going to the airport tomorrow." "Not off to interview more coloured people, are you? They ought to ship them all back to where they came from. Pack them on the Windrush," he muttered, cradling his raised knee with both hands. "Oh, dearie, dearie." "Yes, we all know what you think," said Vanessa, cutting Nancy off. "I'm going to meet my friend Tayo. He's coming to stay with us for a few days." "Oh, dearie, dearie me," Nancy shook her head. "What?" Father exclaimed. "For God's sake, not him. All he wants is your body. Haven't you worked that one out yet? That's all that coloured men ever want." "Well, I'd be jolly happy if he wanted my body now," Vanessa snapped. "Oh, I say," Nancy gasped. "Betty, did you hear that?" All these years, father shouted, your mother and I tried protecting you, but still you want this wretched man. That black man used black magic to put a curse on you. I know he did. Will you shut up, Daddy? I say, Mrs. Halliday, did you hear that? Nancy continued to prod her neighbour. That's the father of Nessa's black child, you know. The child is adopted, you old cow, father shouted. Shh, Joy pleaded, running in to see what the commotion was all about. They do get into a state, don't they? She muttered, looking to Vanessa for moral support. Then Khalid, the cook, arrived to announce the day's lunch: pork chop, cauliflower and raspberry jelly. Did the Arab leave the fat on my pork chop? I'm sure he did, Mr. Richardson. I'm sure he did, Joy repeated, taking his arm, almost kindly, while Vanessa waved goodbye. There were meetings Vanessa was expected to attend in London, but she decided not to go. She called in sick and walked to the high street where she intended to pamper herself, treatment for the stress of life. The Lewis shops were at least one consolation for coming all the way to Sussex to visit father. As she thought of what to buy, she remembered last night's dream. She was at Heathrow, standing in line, waiting for Tayo. Many people waited like her, his old friends from Oxford, various human rights personnel, and some United Nations officials. Tayo was looking for her, she could tell. He kept peering down the line, but when he got to where she stood, he looked straight past her, as though she were invisible, and then he turned around. Suddenly, she realized he was searching for her old self, with the long hair and the short Oxford skirts. Tayo, I'm here, she called, but he didn't hear. He kept on walking back through customs and away, and only she knew why. It was just a dream, but it was enough to make her want to leave her hair loose and buy something that might remind him of the way she used to look, just in case. As she peered into the shop windows, she thought of how he'd held her the last time they met. 4 years ago, she sighed, touching the spot on her neck where he might have kissed her. She was finding nothing in the Lewis shops. She looked in Monsoon, but the colours were too gaudy and the fabrics too delicate. In Caprice, the styles were all wrong, a bizarre mix of skimpy and maternity. But just as she was leaving, something caught her eye. It was a dark brown linen skirt, long and hip-hugging, the sort of thing that would go well with one of her cotton shirts worn open at the neck. So she bought it, and now she felt ready. She planned to arrive at Heathrow early in the morning, collect Tayo and bring him home. She felt certain it was going to be a wonderful first evening. She had pictured it all in her mind's eye, except for Edward and Tayo together, which was a consideration she kept pushing aside. Edward knew nothing of her correspondence with Tayo, nothing at least of the intimate details and her rekindled feelings. What was she thinking? Heathrow, with its sticky heat and crowds, was more unbearable each time Vanessa visited, but she stood patiently, waiting for the British Airways flight from Lagos. The last time she'd come here was to see Suleiman off on his travels. She sighed, recalling how they'd fought. At least, they'd both apologised, but it was one of those fights that were not easily forgotten. It would take time to heal. She watched as the line of Nigerians snaked its way out with trolleys piled high with suitcases, baskets, and cardboard boxes of all shapes and sizes. She expected Tayo to be delayed. Customs would be asking questions about his length of stay and the purpose of his visit, but he would get through. They had double-checked. Soon, the line of passengers disappeared, and a new set of travellers arrived. Where was Tayo? She looked again at his telex. Passport returned, arriving Heathrow 16:30, BA 263, kind regards, Tayo. She'd got the time and the flight right, so where was he? She walked to the desk to inquire. At first they wouldn't tell her whether he was on the passenger list. Policy, they said. She asked for a supervisor, and then the supervisor's boss, and eventually they checked for her. Tayo was not on the list.